Okay, welcome everyone to the 49th Annual Midwest Philosophy Colloquium at the University of Minnesota Morris. The Midwest Philosophy Colloquium is one of our campus's oldest speaker series. Over the decades, it has hosted dozens of distinguished philosophers, luminaries of the field such as Saul Kripke, John Searle, and J.L. Mackie. In recent years, our focus has shifted to hosting more early and mid-career scholars whose works we deem to be especially timely and relevant to the broader campus community. It is in that spirit that we introduce this year's theme, the philosophy of the Trump administration. As most now can appreciate, the Trump administration marks a profound break from previous administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. Many think this departure from the status quo is merely a function of Donald Trump's personality. Others will grant that there are sociological shifts behind the movement. Fewer, however, are aware of its philosophical underpinnings. Indeed, even politicians themselves are often unaware of their philosophical commitments. This year's Midwest Philosophy Colloquium is devoted to filling such gaps. And I want to mention that this year's Midwest Philosophy Colloquium is also supported with generous funding from the American Enterprise Institute. Our speaker today, our second speaker of two, is Kevin Vallier. Kevin Vallier is a professor of philosophy at the University of Toledo, where he is director of research at the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. Vallier's interests lie primarily in political philosophy, ethics, philosophy of religion, and philosophy, politics, and economics, or PPE. He is the author of 4 monographs, 5 edited volumes, and more than 60 peer-reviewed book chapters and journal articles. His books include Liberal Politics and the Public Faith Beyond Separation, Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, and Trust in a Polarized Age. His newest book is All the Kingdoms of the World, on radical religious alternatives to liberalism. His next book will assess the philosophical coherence of fusionist conservatism. So join me in giving Dr. Vallier a warm UMM welcome.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to Deanne. Does everyone have a handout? I feel like there may be some new people who don't. There's some notes. When I was much younger in my undergraduate days, in the early 2000s, I went to Washington University of St. Louis an atheist, and within 3 years, I was a Christian theist. And one of the things that was really fun to do at that time in St. Louis was to have knockdown, drag out inter-Christian theological debates. So St. Louis University, there are 2 other Catholic institutions there. There's an Anglican seminary, a Reformed seminary, a lot of evangelicals, a Lutheran seminary, and they were just seminarians and graduate students and everyone, and we would argue. And I remember very clearly that most of the arguments were theological or metaphysical. But I've been studying political philosophy, and one of the shocking things that came up was the variety and range of different political views held by these Christian groups. And one of the views I encountered was very, very strange. It didn't have a name then, we didn't really have a name for it. But there were very precursor versions to what you may have heard described as Catholic integralism. And on this view of politics, politics has both a temporal and a spiritual mission. And part of what political order is supposed to do is to orient people's lives to salvation insofar as it effectively can, under the guidance of in the Catholic case, right, the Pope, who's the head of the church. And a lot of these ideas seem just completely bizarre to me, but I was really interested in them as matters of philosophical coherence or theological coherence. And, then when I went to graduate school at Arizona, everyone was, very kind of materialistic and atheist. And I said, well, I'm very interested in these strange questions, but I'll set them aside some future day. Starting in around 2016, 2017, these things, all things that we had been debating at a very abstract level that I never knew anyone cared about, started to pop up all over the internet, particularly after Trump was elected. Because what had happened when Trump was elected was that it broke a kind of ideological current on the right. And there were a whole host of new groups that had emerged as a result of Trump's election. And among those groups, perhaps the most intellectually rich and sophisticated of the factions of the new right, as we've come to call them, were these Catholic integralists. Now, initially, they were quite an eclectic group, but they were committed to a very kind of radical reconsideration of the nature of the state and how it functions. It's not to be neutral, as many liberals think, but to be take the side of God and the church. So these people who I began to get to know and blog on some, because I've been interested in these puzzles, I thought, oh, I have tenure, what are these nutty people doing? And so I started interacting with them. And then one day, I get an email from Oxford University Press's politics editor. And he says, well, people are pretty interested in this stuff. Do you want to write a book on this? And I was like, oh man, I'm tenure. This is what tenure's for. I'm going to engage the ideas on the new right. I'm interested in them. I think I can handle them fairly. And so I started bulking up on a lot of history of the church, a lot of different theology, historical teachings and political theology, in particular, theological questions about how politics should function, the purpose of the state, and order. I used a lot of tools from philosophy of religion and for PPE, philosophy, policy, and economics, to try to assess this integralist position. Now, many people would say, oh, this is so obscure. This is so strange. I mean, this is just your fascination. Yeah, you've been fascinated with this weird stuff yourself. And now, okay, there's a couple of dozen people, including like Harvard law professor, that are into this. But I'm like, look, I thought it was interesting. Everyone's talking about this. They're getting written up all over the place. Like, they're connected with this guy, Pat Deneen, who's fairly well known, who had written this book in 2018, Why Liberalism Failed. They had a huge presence on Twitter, blogs, new publications. They have a massive effect on young Catholics, especially young Catholic men. And so, you know, I wrote the best book I knew how to write on the subject. And one of the weirdest things in the world happened, which is that this obscure debate that I have been fascinated with since I was very young, maybe 18 or 19, there's a new person that came into the orbit of these Catholic integralists, many of whom is rebranded as Catholic post-liberals to give a little less radical edge to their views and seem a little bit less medieval. And one of these people in 2019 was a man slightly younger than me named J.D. Vance, who had written this book, Vallier, and was kind of an up-and-comer. And you know, I kind of watched his trajectory. I'm from Ohio. He, you know, ran for Ohio Senate, and he had identified as a Catholic post-liberal, not an integralist, not a full radical, but as this Catholic post-liberal. And so then he's a senator, and I think, okay, well, like his views are too weird for him to be like vice president. Like he's not going to, Trump's not going to pick him. And Trump, you know, just 2022 or 23. 23, it was like, well, I mean, Trump will probably be in jail or something. He's definitely not going to win every swing state in the caucus, right? And I thought I was going to pick some standard mainline conservative. But then particularly his kids, I think, really made the case that like you've really got to hit this Vance guy. And so I've been watching his development and Vance's Senate campaign, and in 2022, he had actually keynoted an integralist conference at Franciscan University Steubenville during the time in which he was running for office. I didn't need any votes down there, and they didn't have any money to give him. So in the case, the reason he was there because he took these ideas seriously. I thought this is going to be very, very strange to have the senator that's like really interested in all of these. It's really complicated and obscure and sometimes a little scary, but like he's really interested in ideas. He's really interested in theory. And then Trump picked him. And all of a sudden, I'm getting calls from like the Associated Press and New York Magazine, Religion News Service. They want to talk for hours about Vance. I'm like, well, I know a lot about post-liberalism. About this guy Vance. I mean, I know of him. I know who he is. I know about globalization and all this stuff. And I thought, well, surely they weren't going to win, and then they won. And it dawned on me, we have what is probably the most like, in terms of political philosophy, sophisticated vice presidents in all of American history. And it probably, almost certainly the richest political thinker in terms of political thought since Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and from 1952 to 1960. So I'm talking to all these people about this guy, J.D. Vance, because I started off in a completely crazy little idiosyncratic place when I was a teenager. And now all of a sudden, I'm talking to the Associated Press about the Vice President of the United States. What a strange story on a bizarre trip. But the thing that turned out to be the case about Vance is that it wasn't just the post-liberals that he hung out. He knew all the new right factions. He knew everybody. And he would give these speeches periodically every few years at the national conservatism conferences. He had one before he was a senator, explaining why he stopped being a libertarian. It's pretty interesting. He gave one in 2020 where he'd gone hardcore populist, called The Professors of the Enemy. And last year he gave a talk there called America is a Nation. All three of them are pretty theoretically sophisticated. And then he gave two very important talks this year. One at the American Dynamism Summit, where he was trying to reconcile the fact that he had, loved a lot of new technology, and including artificial intelligence. Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, had been one of his first employers. He worked for Mythical Capital, Thiel's venture capital firm. So Vance gave this really interesting thing. Well, okay, I like technology, but I also like high domestic wages for workers. How do I reconcile this stuff? Because people had been pressing him on this on either side. Like, where are you on this tech right? Are you tech right? Are you populist or whatever? And he even said on Twitter, I saw him tweet this. He's like, yeah, I need to write something on this. So he writes this speech, and American Compass's new magazine has got the publishing rights for it. So I decided I would get knee deep in a lot of his thinking, because he supposedly has these different currents, and to try to work out what his actual views were, because his theory is leading to his policy, in my opinion. And I think his influence has been limited in some ways by the tech right, particularly Musk's influence. So I think it's been muted more than I expected it to be. And yet Vance is also not completely against the tech right, which for reasons I've discussed it's pretty interesting that he isn't. And so one of the things that so he gives this speech trying to reconcile his populism with his optimism about technology. Okay. And then he gives this other speech, which many of you will know, where he was speaking to leaders of the European Union. And he attacks them ferociously for being for AI, artificial intelligence regulation. Which for someone who's a very traditional Catholic, I mean, to be so gung-ho about this new technology, it's a little odd. And so I started to see in following his speeches that there were these attempts to kind of reconcile or make sense of tensions in his influences. And so I thought I would give the Vice President of the United States of America the opportunity to, or at least I would use is trying to think out his views to identify some of these tensions, and then maybe to try to see if they could be resolved. So, we have a vice president who has a background, an incredibly eclectic background of a whole range of very strange views on the right, who's very, very interested in reconciling, so much so that he would actually be challenged on Twitter about a philosophical inconsistency, and then write an essay and then give it as a speech to a bunch of entrepreneurs and then have to be published later. This is what the founders did, right? It's a very, very strange thing. And I came to it in a very, very strange way. But it puts me in a position, I think, to hopefully convey to all of you the richness of what's going on. So that's way more by way of story that I give. But when you're talking about not some obscure philosopher, but the Vice President of the United States, the most powerful country in the world, we want to give a little bit of a background. Vance is my age, there's never been a major federal politician that's had any kind of authority that's younger than me. But we're basically the same age, and so we know a lot of the same people. And he's good friends with all the integralists. I critique them. I mean, it's a very strange thing, but it's consequential for policy. And it's consequential for policy in a couple of different ways, because as I'll explain in a moment, Vance has this Catholic traditionalist edge, which leads to certain kind of policies, right? Pro-life. He's got the populist bit, which that has real consequences for policy, like immigration and trade. And then he's got the techno-optimism stuff, which is real consequences because he's against AI regulation. So each of these three strands, I think, play a tremendous role in what he supports. And so I think it's of great interest to us whether these things actually fit together. Do they actually cohere? And this is the kind of thing that I don't know if I ever talked to Vance about it, but it would be a lot of fun to talk to him. And I disagree with him on many things, but we share a very intense interest in these ideas. All right. So I've already alluded to these three different, I've already mentioned these three different perspectives that I think come together. So I want to talk a bit about them. So Vance goes to work for Thiel once he finishes up at Yale Law School. And this is before he converts to Catholicism. He's an atheist at this point, and he's no popular sympathies. So he hears Thiel give a speech at Yale Law School in 2011 that basically makes clear y'all are chasing prestige. This is not going to lead to happiness. You should throw yourself headfirst into projects that are valuable, that change the world, and so on. And a lot of this fits with Thiel's sort of broader, his own philosophical background, which is actually very interesting in itself. But he'd written this book, 0 to 1, which is basically his philosophy of business. And his philosophy of business, in essence, is too many people trash being a monopolist. Yeah, you don't want to be a government-protected monopolist, but you also don't necessarily want to be in a perfectly competitive part of the economy. You want to be the first company that comes to produce a product that is so amazing that you create a new market. That's what 0 to 1 is. You go from nobody doing the thing to one person doing the thing. So Thiel's whole background philosophy is a kind of optimism about technology because of an optimism about creative destruction, which is, Schumpeter says is the central feature of capitalism is that it creates, but it also destroys and disrupts. And so Vance's initial ideological influence in many ways, he had many others, but a very, very big influence is Peter Thiel's techno-optimism. And thinking that ultimately the forces of creative destruction, if they're sort of organized in the right way or in balance, a good thing for humanity, and that you could generally count on technological advances to be on balance good for humanity. Now, what's interesting about Thiel is that he has at times claimed to be a Christian, and I don't know how he fits all this together. But I think one of the most interesting things here is that Thiel had a tremendous influence on Vance, and he also supported Vance's Senate campaign, pretty serious degree. And I don't think Thiel has particularly Catholic traditionalist commitments. It's also the case that the techno-optimists, a lot of them have a very, very, very different worldview that Roman Catholics have. And I'll come back to this a couple of times, but one of the most fascinating things is just what they think people are. The Silicon Valley folks tend to think the person is a digital kind of organization, a function, a kind of program, right? Because that's how you could be uploaded from your body into the cloud, right? What you are is a program, in the same sense you get uploaded. But for any Catholic, the human person's a compound of soul and body, but that's a unity, a single, what Horace would call ultimately called hylomorphic unity of soul and body. And your spiritual nature is created and ordered by God. And your biological nature is a part of your nature, and it's fixed and immutable. And so on the sort of traditional Roman Catholic view, humans are not programs. Humans are, I like C.S. Lewis's quip here, spirit matter amphibians. And wildly different perspectives. Just to give another example, Catholics are totally opposed to in vitro fertilization. Trump was okay with this. Vance went along with the IVF order, but it's also the case that we know now that Elon Musk is a very big fan of IVF for various reasons. And so, and he's the most influential person in what we call the tech right. He's one of the big techno-optimists. And has done a tremendous amount to try to advance that particular goal. So you have these people very optimistic about technology, but part of the reason, and Vance doesn't share this piece, is that they have a different view of persons. So if it turns out, for instance, for many on the tech right, that if biological humans cease to exist, that's not the end of human civilization. It might only be the beginning, right? Because there'll be digital intelligence. And many of them think this. In fact, there's just a box piece on this about how many in the AI community essentially don't think there's a difference between digital and biological intelligence. And so if AI wipes us out, yeah, it's bad that some intelligences die, but other intelligences continue. So you have about as different a view about the human person and human value as you could possibly have. And I don't know if Vance ever held those precise views, but that's a very important influence, and it gets muted as he goes populist, but it's there and it's earlier because it doesn't convert to Catholicism until 2019. It's pretty late. Okay. In fact, many of the Catholic post-liberals are adult converts to Catholicism. I mean, Adrian Vermeule, who's, I mean, in some ways, the most intellectually sophisticated, he's a professor at Harvard Law, and he only converted to Catholicism in 2016. So you kind of see what we're saying about the tech optimism part, right? Technology drives progress and can solve many of humanity's challenges. Thiel is one of the big theorists here in terms of his own thinking. Thiel, I think, was one of the people that got Musk to move right and to get more involved, right? He was one of the people who encouraged Musk to buy Twitter. And we've seen a kind of partial political realignment in Silicon Valley, particularly right after Trump was elected. I mean, you have people, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, Mark Zuckerberg, and so on, and they're just, you know, Jeff Bezos, they're given special seats at the inauguration, right? So there's explicitly this attempt to build a coalition politically with different groups, like pure populists, lots of moral traditionalists, and then these tech right people. Okay, so hold that piece. That's our first bit, so you get the techno-optimism bit. Now let's go to the Catholic bit. And many of you know the basic tenets of Christianity, and I won't repeat them all here. And most of you will know that Catholicism has certain distinctives as a form of Christianity. But the Catholic Church's approach to what we call liberalism has usually been one of antagonism. And the reasons for this are pretty complex. Liberalism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Okay, it's not used in a consistent way. I do think you can speak of liberal political thought as a unity. And the way I think about it very roughly is it's a political ideology that stresses the natural freedom and equality of persons, and then stresses the importance of organizing society so that there's a wide berth or scope for toleration, and a promotion of what we might call a harmony of interests. The view that there aren't inherent class conflicts and natural hierarchies built into society. There's the sense in which, say, capital and labor, or different races or different genders can be equals and reconciled to one another. Right? A key feature of many forms of socialism, for instance, is a class conflict model of society, right? But liberalism, particularly in the tradition of political economy, which is mostly liberal, is an attempt to show that postulated conflicts between groups are illusory. At the same time, however, liberalism has not always been consistent on this, because there's a tendency of certain Enlightenment branches of liberalism, and I don't think all of them are, to be extremely suspicious of organized religion, because the thought is it's, you know, epistemically, it's not sufficiently epistemically humble, it's not tolerant, right? Now, liberalism in Protestant countries has gotten along with the church much better. So, you know, in England and the United States, the relationship between liberalism and Christianity is very, very different than, say, in France or Italy in the 19th century. It's very, very different. And on the continent, liberals tended to be much more anti-clerical, meaning that they were oftentimes just opposed to clergy in general. And so they were much more focused, say, on subverting the church or fully privatizing the Christian religion. So it was only a private matter. Now, in the 19th century, also was the case that there were these wars of unification, including Italian unification. And one of the things that happened with Italian unification is that many people don't remember that the Pope was a temporal sovereign outside of Vatican City in the Papal States for 1,000 years. And it wasn't until 1870 when Italian unification forces annexed the Papal States. You have to understand the Pope was actually a temporal ruler of a non-trivial amount of land, territory, and cities. So the popes, the two late 19th century popes, Pius IX and Leo XIII, became what were called prisoners of the Vatican. And while they were prisoners of the Vatican, they issued a number of different encyclicals, and also what is potentially an infallible papal pronouncement condemning liberalism in various forms. Such that there were many 19th century Catholics that were convinced that liberalism was not only a problem, it was demonic and heretical, and it had to be suppressed. Now, in the history of the and the thought was, look, it's too individualistic. It's too much of a fan of capitalism, even though the church also rejected socialism in many ways. This doctrine of separation of church and state was also heretical, dangerous. They resisted the attempt to ban Catholic schools, which many liberals on the continent were pursuing, in order to get people more public spirited. And so you end up with, and the reason I told this history, this very strong strain of Catholicism that's very, very, very anti-liberal. And it persists fully through the 20th century until the 60s and the Second Vatican Council. But it still persists even after that in certain Catholic authoritarian countries like Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal. But in the United States, these views had never really been dominant and had mostly just disappeared from memory. But they were pretty constant throughout the whole history of the liberal tradition, that Catholicism was very anti-liberal. It's against its neutrality, its stress on individual freedom. Not that Catholics were always against all of these things in different ways, but the leadership certainly issued a number of very clear condemnations. Anything liberal. You should look up the syllabus, Pope Pius IX syllabus of errors. So it was always within Catholic tradition to try to push back against liberalism. But American Catholics had come to believe that they could get along with liberal order. And many Catholics believed that until Obergefell and the legalization of same-sex marriage and the rapid progress of the LGBT. Catholics had kind of come out of the shadows in various ways that fought to be treated as equals, 60s, 70s, 80s, and before. And now all of a sudden their views on LGBT issues made them beyond the pale. And many young Catholics thought, and I think some of these post-liberal intellectuals rose to prominence, like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, because they were making the argument that liberalism was a threat to the church all along, just as the late 19th century popes had taught. Among young Catholic intellectuals, which you have to understand, on the right, Catholic intellectuals have been tremendously influential at the highest intellectual levels since the very beginning, like Bill Buckley, for instance. And so the ground was kind of watered for many right-wing Catholic young people to think that something was fundamentally wrong with liberal order and had to be replaced in some very important way. Vance is one of these people. Right? So Patrick Deneen, who wrote Why Liberalism Failed, they're friends. In fact, there's a picture of them together that some of them post on Twitter before Vance was a senator. And Deneen has been instrumental, and Vermeule been instrumental in developing this doctrine of Catholic post-liberalism. And a lot of the stress is opposing the idea that the state should be neutral in moral and religious matters, opposing the stress on individual rights versus the common good, of stressing the primacy of the spiritual in political life, that we shouldn't just leave the spiritual to private things, it's an inherently public thing. And also stressing, I think, in many ways, that stopping the left requires, and Deneen comes to this slowly, but Vermeule is very adamant on this point, that stopping the left ultimately requires a regime change of a kind, right? Where, like Deneen's 23 book, where the sort of left-wing progressive elites are very dangerous, and the only way to stop them is to displace them and replace them. There's also a hostility to capitalism, to markets, that isn't socialist. It's not populist in the same sense, though, because it's not anti-elite, very pro-elite, and it's not nationalist. It's internationalist. Catholicism has always prided itself on being an international faith. Even when it was so dominant in Europe, it cut across all the different European city-states and local kings and so on. So you've got this background for Vance, where he knows the Catholic post-liberals, he's reading the Catholic post-liberals, he's giving talks at their conferences, and so he's got this element of this very traditional view of the human person, right, with these inherent fixed biological and spiritual limits. He's got a hostility to the liberal tradition as such, and perhaps some skepticism of democracy as a result. It'd be inaccurate to call them fascists. I'm not using those terms. You can be skeptical of democracy in lots of ways. So libertarians are skeptical of democracy, right? So that's to give you kind of the contours of his post-liberal background and then what the post-liberal doctrine is. So you've got critiques of liberal democracy, From a Catholic perspective, advocating traditional values, Christian virtuous statesman. And the thought here is the state should promote a kind of conservative vision of the common good. Okay, so that's element 2, and it's the most complicated. The last element, the sort of populist element, is pretty easy to explain. It's the thing that's the least obscure, so I can go through it quickly. When Vance writes the essay, How I Joined the Resistance, 2020 in the Lamp, that's him saying, okay, now I've got the Trump phenomenon. I actually understand what's going on. We all know that he was very critical of Trump. Early on, described him as an opioid, even as someone that just cures the pain of the working class, but doesn't actually do anything to solve it. But he completely changes his tune. And some people think it was opportunistic. He argues that it came from reflecting on the kind of failures of mainstream conservatism. He always was stressing his failures to take certain struggles of the white working class seriously. But he began to extend those convictions more and more systematically, or at least his telling of the stories, he misunderstood the possibility of the Trump phenomenon. So you start to see him give talks like the Professors of the Enemy that are very anti-elite, right? The techno-optimists are pretty elitist. The Catholic postliberals are pretty elitist. Populists not really elitist. He starts emphasizing immigration restrictions. Adrian Vermeule thinks we should have open borders for Roman Catholics, because ultimately he wants a Roman Catholic state. There's a blog post he talks about this. I think it's 2019. In fact, he wanted a hemispheric empire under the rule of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I mean, his Twitter profile picture was even an EU flag with Mary right in the middle of it. So you have the post-liberals that are thinking about, okay, well, how do we establish a kind of multinational Catholic Christendom like we had before, right? So this is, again, not a nationalist view. Many of them said, well, we like nationalism as a second best option to protect the common good, but like ultimately nationalism is wrong, okay? So now Trump's got this third element, right? He's got this nationalist stuff, he's got the trade restriction stuff, he's got the immigration restriction stuff, he's got the pro-Trump stuff, but he's distinctively populist too, right? So central to populism is the idea that there's a kind of more pure people against a corrupt elite. And I'm of the view, like, I'm not a populist, but like periodically populism can be useful as a corrective because you do have corrupt elites sometimes, right? So you have to do something about that. You see it from the left and the right. So like Bernie Sanders is very much like a left-wing populist. He's really come into his own under kind of Trump Musk because he's doing all these oligarchy speeches. And I actually think they're landing a couple of blows. I mean, I'm no Bernie Sanders person, but I actually think he's perhaps his most effective rhetorically that he's ever been, despite his age, if you watch some of his videos and speeches. But it's a different kind of elite, right? Because Trump says he's against the elite, right? Vance is vice president, but he says we're anti-regime, right? And I think there's a sense in which that doesn't make sense and a sense in which it makes perfect sense. So on the right, you have Donald Trump and before him Pat Buchanan that are very focused on nationalism, anti-establishment sentiment. Okay. You now have all the pieces. Raising the tensions is not hard because I've already alluded to them. We can go through them relatively quickly. I'll try not to go too fast, but I have some time. So one of the stresses of Vance's populism and nationalism is high domestic wages for American workers. Consistent stress of his all throughout his political awakening, whether he's anti-Trump or pro-Trump. You've got to be able to create high domestic wages for families in order to maintain stable families, in order to maintain stable communities. And it's the loss of the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt and so on that has created a whole lot of different problems and social maladies, ones that he has criticized the left repeatedly because they can't acknowledge that there are oppressed white people. White men anyway. And this is, a line of Vance's that you can hear like the inability to recognize the unique struggles of the white working class, even on his one of his very first interviews on NPR with Terry Gross, where she's pushing him on this and very humble, pushes back extremely well. He's all the relevant empirical studies right under his belt. And so we've got this worker protection, prioritize American jobs, high American domestic wages, right? And you've also got this really fascinating element where he gives this speech to the EU where he's attacking them for AI manipulation. Now, let's just pause. Okay, let's just think about this, right? So, in essence, we have these large language models and now increasingly reasoning models, and they're improving more rapidly than even the most sophisticated technical people, even the people who invented the GPT modeling, thought that it would go. And no one really knows what it can do. And basically all the major tech CEOs, many of whom have backgrounds in neuroscience, that the head of Google DeepMind is a Nobel laureate, and they all think we're going to have artificial general intelligence within 5 years, with the exception of the head of Meta, LeCun, I forget his first name, although that story's a little more complicated. So you've got these folks saying there's going to be like this intelligence explosion, and we don't know what it can do, and it could be incredibly disruptive. It could change everything. Bring in a whole new form of economic organization. And so you would think like a MAGA person would have worries, right? Like this is going to disrupt the whole economy. It's going to change everything. It could automate stuff. It could take away jobs. How's that supposed to work? It also, of course, has some tension initially, at least, not at a deep level with Catholic postliberalism, right? Because the thought is like, look, there are like inherent limits to the person that we're supposed to respect, and there are ways in which technology can get out of there's a way in which technology can get totally out of control, and it can dictate the whole terms of society to people. And there's actually a strand of postliberalism, particularly before Deneen. If you look at my earlier teams, he's working with a number of different people like Michael Hanby, for instance, and they're being very critical of liberalism as being sort of associated with this idea of Bacon's empire of science. Like basically what liberalism is all about is like the worship of science. And so much of the early Catholic post-liberal stuff that was coming together was like very much opposing liberalism as trying to model society on the sciences. Okay, so like it deeply built in to Catholic post-liberalism is a skepticism of unmoored worship progress. Deneen even said in one interview, he said, well, what's the enemy? Because he doesn't like the mainline Reagan conservatives because they're right liberals and the left are left liberals. He says, what I'm against is the party of progress. The party of progress. And then his good friend says, we're not going to do anything about AI at all because it's probably going to make things worse. The most potentially transformative and disruptive technology just about ever. Total hands off. Total hands off. So there's a tension with Catholic post-liberalism, there's a tension with populism that's just manifest, right? So Vance sees this with the populism stuff. He sees it, people are challenging him. He says on Twitter, I need to write this up, writes it up. He gives this speech at the American Dynamism Summit a couple of weeks ago. And he's trying here, I think, really hard to square the circle. He tries to argue that there are ways we can organize public policy without regulating AI so that it works to the advantage of American workers. So how do we get AI to maintain high domestic wages? Well, it has to amplify the productivity of the people using it rather than substituting for them, rather than replacing them. So Vance actually went so far as to compare AI to ATMs. Right? We don't have tellers distributing cash in the same way. Like that's good. Having automated teller machines, that's great. And he thinks, look, we'll always, like a lot of very classical liberal economists will say, well, you don't have to worry about automation. Automation is going to introduce all of these new opportunities for people, all these new jobs, and it'll totally be great. And all the doomers about technology have always been wrong. This is essentially what Vance argued. The argument's a bit subtler than this, but the idea is that technology should increase labor productivity. And if labor is more productive, companies will be able to afford to pay them more. He also proposes incentivizing tech companies to hire American workers through deregulation and tax breaks. So basically, it just says straight up, if you're trying to employ workers, we're going to deregulate you, we're going to cut your taxes, and if you start going overseas, we're not going to do that. So the idea is those gains to the productivity won't go to other countries, but will stay here. He also thinks we should have immigration restrictions so that wages will be bid up instead of letting everyone compete for the same jobs, which allows the companies to keep wages low, right? Because everyone's competing for the jobs. So initially, it kind of makes sense, right? It's like we got to AI's great, techno-optimist part, right? No real worries that he raises in these speeches. But we got to help American workers. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to reward people for focusing here. We're going to restrict the labor supply so they have to pay people. So that's the argument of the speech he gave. Okay. There's a couple of different worries. Of course, it's not an automatic, as he understands, event that firms that become more productive give those gains to productivity to their workers, right? What is it that actually does that? Well, they have to compete against each other, right? So they bid up the wages up until the point where they can no longer afford to do it more, right? That's how workers gain, is that, yes, labor becomes more productive, but also there's lots of competition to bid wages up to the point, to the point of marginal productivity of labor development, doing much economy. But it might be the case, for instance, that nationalist policies reduce competition for labor reduce the number of employers. So there's less competition among employers, which could depress wage growth. This isn't just some trivial possibility. There's plenty of companies, foreign, multinational companies that come here and are competing for American workers. It's also the case that the net effects, say, of restricting trade and immigration, most economists think will lower productivity generally. You have more people, there's more kinds of jobs, there are more people to sell goods and services to. The point is just that the market dynamics here are complicated, and no one really knows exactly how it's going to go. And so if Vance is right, it's not clear how often or whether he will be. It will be, I think, a pretty happy coincidence if he was correct. It's also the case, I think, that immigration restrictions can have complex economic effects because immigrants aren't adding their productivity to labor domestically in other areas, making other parts of the economy richer and people, say, more able to buy the goods and services of the workers that Vance wants to help. Vance wants to help farmers. Right now, we're looking at the tariff situation where, there's a lot of their exports that it's going to be harder for them to sell now. So the point is just that these nationalist policies, particularly if they trigger trade wars and stuff like that, aren't necessarily going to be a very good way to keep domestic wages high enough to counteract the effects of AI. It probably helps a little, right? But if AI is a really big force pushing in the other direction with all kinds of creative destruction, this is pretty thin rule to protect against this potentially incredibly disruptive technology. Because the effects that he cites, yeah, they kind of push in his direction, but there's plenty of other stuff that could push in the other direction. I think there are just plenty of other factors that could keep wages low, particularly once you throw AI in the picture. Like if you didn't even have AI in the picture, it's not thought that protectionism is especially good at keeping domestic wages high by economists. But if you have this transformative technology, then I think it's like even less obvious. And so I think it was just pretty cavalier that they're going to be able to make sure that AI works to the advantage of the American working class. I appreciate that he tried to reconcile them. But I think the argument was not very compelling and wouldn't be very compelling and wasn't very compelling to basically any economist who studies this stuff. Now, the economists are always right about everything. But I just thought the argument didn't succeed because the policy mechanisms and the economic mechanisms, the model that Vance is implicitly operating was much too simple. Okay, so that's an important, very, very important tension because I think it's very plausible. I mean, no one really knows what this technology can do. And so it's next to impossible to say what's going to happen. I mean, a lot of it seems like it's automating knowledge. It's going to automate knowledge work. So it may not actually hurt the American poor as much as it helps the upper middle class. Again, we don't know what it can do. No one knows what it can do, right? Even if it stopped progressing, right? If I just stopped progressing tomorrow, we still are only scratching the surface of what these models can do for us. And, it's still making tremendous progress faster than anybody thought. It would be I think it would basically be a miracle if the consistent effect of AI development with this light policy touch was to produce high American domestic wages. Where, when, how? No one knows. Again, the very best people don't know what this can do. So for Vance to be that, again, cavalier about, it'll be fine. No populist, certainly no Catholic post-liberal should have that kind of attitude. I think this is something to be approached with enormous gravity, right? If you have either the populist or the post-liberal tendencies. But this leads to what I think is the bigger tension, which is the tension about what we call not the economic tension here, but the anthropological tension. This isn't anthropology as we understand the field, but a term that Catholic postliberals and many others use called philosophical anthropology. Philosophical anthropology is the theory of the human person and the person's function, person's ultimate end. Okay. So the philosophical anthropology of Catholicism is that we're these spirit matter amphibians. We're embodied souls whose aim is to be united with God and other human beings in love forever. Okay, so like that's a very clear, like even when you go to heaven, the ultimate thing is like you get a new body eventually, right? Like humans are incomplete unless we have a biological structure. Okay. We're also incomplete without the spiritual dimension. And the thought here is that there is a sort of fixed human nature that tends to manifest itself effectively over time. There are certain patterns of behavior, like the traditional family, that emerge, natural hierarchies that emerge, and humans do best and flourish when those communities are left to flourish. Now, sometimes it'll need the state, perhaps to stop various forms of vice or other kinds of threats. But by and large, you would sort of look at human civilization and think a lot of people are living pretty well. And technology can actually make people much worse off in lots of ways. They can undermine family structures, they like birth control, one could argue. And many of the integralists have an almost pre-modern approach where they think the medieval period was in some ways a much more fulfilling and spiritually meaningful period of time in Western history than today. There's no hint of that in Vance's Catholic postliberalism. And in fact, he's worked very closely with people and knows people that have a wildly different view of humanity and whose techno-optimism is driven by that very different philosophical anthropology, right? The mind as program, right? And what's staggering about the tech right is they're willing to indulge all kinds of wild speculation about, oh, in a simulation, we be uploaded, the singularity, and then you propose Christianity, and it's like, oh, that's obviously silly. I think it's a pretty weird sort of way of taking certain fantastical scenarios, not taking them seriously, but then also there being this kind of thought that traditional religion is obviously a problem. And I can talk a little bit more about this, but my view about Musk, for instance, you ask him, he actually says he believes in Spinoza's God. And on this view, like basically roughly that the universe is God. And he sees, I think, consciousness as a way that the universe and God is manifesting itself. And I think one of the reasons he thinks he's trying to save humanity is he's trying ultimately as a salvific mission of human civilization, sort of bringing the universe into consciousness to realization of itself. So he's just said in an interview, it's like, I believe in Spinoza's God. So I think a huge amount of what he's trying to do is a kind of spiritual or salvific mission, but it's not a Christian at all. So, he's working closely with folks, and you might say, oh, it's good. Politics makes for strange bedfellows. Let's work together. It's all fine. But I mean, Musk is a really big part of the reason I think that the reproductive policy has been different. I think Trump was always fine with that idea anyway. But there should be a very sharp tension there, right, over these fundamental issues of the purpose of human beings and human life. So you can see, I think, the economic tension, it's like pretty clear, maybe less big of a problem, maybe it'll be okay. I kind of doubt it. Very weird to be a liberal would be more worried about this tech than the post-liberals are, right? They have one job, like to be like emphasize like the philosophical anthropology. This is what they say about woke people. Say, oh, you don't believe in like biology, you don't take biology seriously, you don't believe in the natural difference between men and women. They're cavorting with these people that like think minds are programs, right? And not saying anything, or like not even saying anything about Musk having like 8 IVF babies. I mean, just like that's the kind of thing that a post-liberal should be like, yeah, that's completely crazy and terrible and immoral, gravely immoral. Right? Because it can end up with the destruction of fetal life. So if you look at Deneen and the other post-liberals, they're not criticizing Vance at all. In fact, Deneen even did a Substack post where he's trying to explore the potential compatibility of MAGA and Doge. And he thinks, oh, well, yeah, you could sort of cut government here or there, or whatever, maybe it's compatible, maybe not. And they've just basically become, no offense, but like completely uninteresting because I think they don't want to put Vance in a difficult position. But they have every reason in the world in terms of their broader commitments, have really serious reservations with the tech right and to be really, really pro AI regulation. Because what is humanity? I mean, the post-liberal view, what does humanity lose if we just stopped pursuing AI right now? Like from their perspective, in terms of what's ultimately good and meaningful, what is lost? Like nothing's lost. Like we slow down the compute, maybe we give up some cures for diseases. That's pretty bad. Maybe that's something you have to worry about. But in terms of the ordinary meaning of human life, there being a kind of steady liturgical rhythm to existence. I mean, these are people that really stress the sort of importance of certain religious rhythms of life. They should say, yeah, if it grinds to a halt, that's okay. I mean, maybe even good. So let's slow it down so we at least figure out what this stuff can do. Propose a 90% compute slowdown. They had Ethereum proposed this. Vitalik proposed a 90% slowdown of compute growth. He's another one of Thiel's discoveries, by the way. So we have the situation where Vance is embracing tech-optimism and advocating for minimal AI regulation, which is one of the most significant regulatory decisions in the whole history of the human race, in terms of us having any kind of direct public policy regulatory approach to the world. Like 200 years ago, you don't have the technology to even monitor or really have extensive regulations beyond some pretty crude stuff. So you would think that there would be like this jump to regulate AI, this deep skepticism, grave concern, and it just doesn't seem to be there at all. It wasn't there in the Dynamism Summit. It wasn't there in his speech to the EU. So he's aligned in many ways with a tech elite with a view of human nature that conflicts with Catholic post-liberals. And you would think post-liberals would be wary of unregulated AI due to these fundamental differences. But Vance's stance suggests to me that somehow, I do think there may be explanations of this, the techno-optimist influence right now is outweighing the post-liberal principles. Now, the MAGA part is getting a lot of attention, right, with the trade war and immigration restrictions and so on. But I would say of these three tendencies in Vance, the techno-optimist part, the populist parts are kind of pretty big. They're both getting some response. Post-liberal stuff's doing very, very little work right now. That may change, but that's kind of how I see it. So the tensions in Vance's thought kind of forced him to make choices about which things he's going to emphasize. And it's pretty clear the choices that he's made currently. But we'll see what happens if he shifts to one of the others or some different combination. Particularly as we see what happens with the tech right, I think particularly because the tech right's opposed to trade war with China. So that's going to be a huge deal because that's probably going to be ongoing. So those are the tensions, but trying to take the vice president seriously on his own terms. I'm raising some problems, but trying to do so in a respectful way. I'm grateful to be able to have the opportunity. I'm worried, pretty worried about policy right now. I'm worried that he doesn't seem more worried because he has every reason to be worried. So that's what I wanted to say. So we end up in this very strange world, and a very weird timeline to be in, where I was having these obscure arguments in St. Louis at 18 and 19, and now all of a sudden I'm talking about political philosophy of Vice President of the United States. So, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Vallier, for tradition's sake. We are starting with any questions from students.
Yeah, do you see Vance's ideology in general as mainly being sort of a taking advantage of the situation, and he's sort of going back on his political ideals just to get it with the money, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's the natural cynical read is if someone's an elite level politician, they're not trying to be ideologically consistent, right? They're just being political opportunists. And we're going to make an argument that Vance did exactly this in changing his tune on Trump. I have a different view about this. He did change his view, and I do think he was far too, he's been far too resistant to being critical of Trump before he was VP. And, but if you want to be charitable, you can look at his writings on this, that there was a kind of rationale for it. And maybe it came after the fact, I don't know. But it'd be a lot less fun to give a talk on Vance's thought if I just said he's cynical opportunist. So I'm trying to give it like the best kind of like spin or explanation. And I think it's partly helped by the fact, my case, that he's thinking about these things and trying to work them out, that he's doing stuff he just didn't have to do. Like in 2022, speaking at the Integrals Conference, or like deciding to like write essentially a political philosophy paper while he's vice president, and then to give a talk to all these entrepreneurs where he's trying to reconcile his different commitments. So I think he loves to think about these things. He's pretty nerdy about this stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's probably all mixed in there with all kinds of political incentives. And we don't know exactly what the case is being made behind the scenes. So yeah, I mean, you can look at it, cynical opportunism, and maybe that's true. It's just a whole lot less fun. But it does seem like he's trying to reconcile his commitments in a thoughtful way. So I thought that was worth focusing on. So yeah, I don't know if Vance's heart. I'm going to speak to his heart, but his proposals for how to reconcile his ideals, those I think are worth trying to sort through, whether he really means it or not.
Can you talk a little bit more about why you think the anthropological tension is the biggest one? Because you identified it as the most important one, but it seems to me like, yeah, the IVF issue seems pretty serious, but besides that, it's like, I mean, we're fighting the left, we're getting things done, so why do I care if like Will thinks that we're living in a simulation where we can be in computers, and I think that, it's all about God and being embodied souls.
Yeah, I think by a bigger deal, I meant something like of more sort of like moral and philosophical and spiritual significance.
Mm.
In terms of its actual effects on people's day-to-day lives and policy, you may be right, because the trade war is affecting everybody. Those kinds of restrictions, immigration affects a lot of people.
Mm.
And you've already got a lot of the pro-life victories that can be done at the federal level anyway, right? And so, before Dobbs was overruled, you might think, oh, the life stuff's going to make a huge deal at the federal level. So yeah, in terms of moment-to-moment experience of most Americans, the economic tension is going to be the bigger one. I meant the anthropological tension being the more sort of philosophically and spiritually significant tension. But it's a good point. I mean, I think it's highly, we think of when we talk about trade policy, it's kind of boring. Right? Like it's kind of dry. Abortion is like really exciting in a way, not the act, but like pub debate, right? So yeah, I think that's what I want to say about it. But it's also the case that, it can end up making a huge difference if, for instance, Vance ultimately becomes president, AI is getting totally wild, crazy, and then he tries to put the brakes on it. Now, I think if you're going to do it, you got to do it now, because the bigger it gets, the harder it's going to be to slow down. So the post-liberal stuff, if he starts being motivated post-liberal considerations to slow down AI just as such, right? The populist tendency is just to beat China to the best AI if you can organize policy so that it keeps wages high, right? Very, very MAGA consistent to be on low regulation on AI, and one place I sort of agree with them in trying to keep the Chinese from getting these chips, right? GPUs. So yeah, I think it could be the case that the post-liberal stuff ends up being more significant because of its impact on AI policy. Because it's the post-liberal impulse that should put the brakes on AI in a way that MAGA doesn't necessarily need to.
Right.
Right. So yeah.
Let's do one first.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's actually kind of like a weird alignment with Catholicism and AI. Like even if he's philosophically like, not in agreement with, say, like an Elon Musk or someone who thinks that like the humans are just like totally computable.
Yeah.
I wonder if he's almost like calling their bluff, be like, yeah, develop your AI, have it, automate everything that is computable within the human, and I will be revealed to be correct that the humans do actually have some secret sauce that is incomputable, and like maybe actually in that world, he's happy because, we don't have to, be doing spreadsheets and all that. We can like just engage with like the pure, whatever creative impulses that are the manifestation of the human secret sauce.
Yeah, I mean, if he said anything at all to indicate that, then I would pick up on it. But the speeches the two speeches he gave this year on this, actually maybe the EU one was in December or maybe January. I can't remember exactly when. I think it was January. There's no hint of it being like, go ahead. All right, we'll see what happens. You think this is going to happen, but it's not. It's more just like he thinks it's going to be really good in terms of its like net economic effects. So if he had indicated that, then maybe that would be true. But I listen to those speeches and I don't see any hint of it. And maybe there is, but I have not seen it.
So I have a bunch of questions. I'm gonna limit myself to one.
Yeah.
I don't know if Vance himself has given this defense, but one way that strikes me as not implausible of reconciling the populist strand and the techno-optimist strand is to say, as important as high wages might be, that issue is secondary to the geopolitical conflict with China. Like that, on populist grounds and nationalist grounds, that takes precedence.
Yep.
And so we're going to be techno-optimists because we like technology, we think it's good for the nation, and maybe in general, ceteris paribus, we want high wages, but the priority is beating China to the punch, and that's something that the techno-optimists can agree on, and the populists can agree on. So,
And in a way, the post-liberals, I mean, they do have,
Yeah.
they can't be unsympathetic with stopping China, right?
right,
Yeah, so if Vance's speech had focused on that argument,
mhm,
then maybe, I mean, Vance could shift, right? But the
Yeah.
argument in the speech was that you could use policy to keep
right.
advanced AI with high domestic wages. So I was addressing
No,
his
yeah,
argument that he gave in the speech.
yeah,
But then the question is, okay, can you develop a more consistent one? In that case, though, I don't even think there's anything like distinctively post-liberal or even anti-liberal, because it's not like there weren't liberal Cold Warriors. There are tons of liberal Cold Warriors, right? I mean, JFK is a liberal Cold Warrior,
yeah.
right? And so the idea of keeping chips from China and staying ahead in AI, that's not even opposed to liberalism, right? This is one reason I think the AI arms race is crazy and terrifying, as it will be not too long. Could be really almost like completely bipartisan, right? Because I mean, if you think about with China, like take abortion policy in China, right? Like Hawaii, the one-child policy, tons of forced abortions, right? But like pro-choicers are against forced abortion and pro-lifers are against forced abortion, right? So like everyone's against forced abortion in the United States, like nobody's for forced abortion, right? And so there are certain issues that, say China pursues a policy and the whole American political spectrum thinks, no, that has to stop, right? So, for instance, on freedom of religion, right? There's, broad spectrum American agreement that the way that Chinese approach freedom of religion is deeply problematic, human rights violation. So it'd be really interesting to see if there's a kind of national unity effect with the China thing. We'll see some of this with the trade war and see how people feel about it. The problem is that Trump hasn't made the stakes clear to the American people, and he really needs to be less erratic and just communicate very clearly and just make the argument. I don't think it works, but like says, look, we were told by globalist elites that if we had free trade with China, that it would become a liberal democracy and rich and free. That didn't happen. It used its wealth to suppress people and have concentration camps and to do mass surveillance, and also to dramatically improve the position of the poor in their country. So things didn't go as predicted. We're in a situation now where there's another technological issue that's a very big deal. And we have to economically decouple from China because we have to stop helping them beat us, right? I think if I were president or whatever, but I just think he should go on national television and just like make the case. He's ready to make the case. He's making the case against China for 40 years, right? On somewhat different grounds now. I just wish you would, if you communicate directly, that's something I think, even many liberals, the tendency of liberals is to say, let's do free trade. But of course, overwhelming tendency But even Adam Smith thought that you could disrupt free trade for national security reasons, right? We don't have to trade nuclear. We were under no obligation to have free trade in uranium during the Cold War, right? No liberal said we should be able to sell uranium to Soviets, right? So I actually want to say like it's a way of reconciling populism and techno-optimism, but it's also a way of like reconciling like a lot of people.
Mhm.
And that's not a problem, actually. I like reconciliation, but yes, that's kind of my thought is that a lot of people can take on that line of reasoning.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
My question is on something you said earlier about politics, that
Yeah.
like, oh, what Vance is doing now, he's going out, he's writing these essays, making these speeches, like this is what the founders did.
Yeah.
Do you think that Vance, and I think to a lesser extent, but certainly also Vivek Ramaswamy, do you think the rise of these kinds of politicians on the right primarily, but also a little bit on the left, who speak in terms of first principles and who convey their ideas in deep ways, do you think that reflects a broader trend? Do you think that's going to be good for them electorally? Do you think it's going to be good for the polity?
So Reagan was not bad at this, and he had been doing it a long time.
Mhm.
Like, for instance, I think he was working for GE when he gave his Medicare speech in the 60s. He was for Goldwater. I don't think he was as reflective as Vance is, but I think Reagan was also a lot smarter than people gave him credit for. So he talked about ideas a lot, but he's not like trying to reconcile tensions in his own thought like that, right? So there's not been none of it. It's also the case that both that particularly in the Tea Party, a lot of that period of time, you're hearing a lot of libertarian thought, right? And so particularly the Pauls, right? So Ron Paul and Rand Paul are making this case. Now they've done the reading and they get the view, but Ron Paul has this very sort of internally consistent libertarianism that doesn't seem to trouble him about tensions. And I like Ron Paul, but like Vance has taken this to another level because any ideology has internal tensions, right? And so I think I see Vance as taking. So the first thing I want to say is like, it is more sophisticated, but like I wanted to make clear the way it is, because Vance is saying I have a view and there are tensions in my view and I need to address those tensions, right? That's not really like with Ron Paul. He's making the case for libertarians, right? Smart, like in many cases, really smartly and carefully and consistently and bravely, but it's not at the same sort of level, right? But you look at the founders and they're saying, well, we have these different values and should we have bicameralism or what should we do about the national bank? Every one of these issues. So it's that part of the broader trend. This is very interesting. It's pretty rare in itself, right? And I don't really see other new right or MAGA politicians with much intellectual patience. Putting it mildly. In fact, this is one of my problems with many of the new right intellectuals themselves, is they want the quick blog post, the tweet, to quickly win the election. They want to defeat the left. But when it comes to their actual positive details of what they want, they're a lot sort of weaker there. And so I think that kind of movement can kind of fizzle out pretty fast. And I think while things were looking very delivered from Trump the first 30 days, it's very hard to say we should be using like the executive branch to win the culture war when the executive destroys like trillions of dollars of wealth in a couple of days. So I think the new right's going to have some real trouble saying that we need the strong political power to win the culture war when it's so manifestly, disastrously used. So I don't know what happens with the new right under the Trump administration. Nobody knows the future. I have no idea. I feel less certain about the future than I ever have in my entire life. So who knows? But my sense is Vance is pretty rare. It's pretty rare. So another reason I wanted to talk about it is it's not a common thing. So yeah.
Going off of that, on the same Vance Primer, how do you think he's like uniquely impacting like the atmosphere or like agendas of the Trump administration?
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting because I know that he makes arguments to Trump, but ultimately he carries out Trump's directives and apologizes for them, makes the case for them. And then you could say like, well, the politician has to be a rhetorician, and there's a certain demands where If you're the vice president, like you took the job, like you defend the president and his agenda no matter what, right? Maybe that's the way to think about it. But right now, it does seem like, at least on the outside, that he's perfectly happy and comfortable with the tech right. So maybe he privately has some reservations and is looking at the right time to push back. Well, my view about this is that because his techno-optimism, I think, came first, before the Catholic postliberalism and the populism, it might be just like really deep set for him. And so he may be perfectly comfortable. I mean, he worked for Peter Thiel, like he can't be that uncomfortable around Elon Musk, ultimately, I don't think. And so I think he's like intrinsically like kind of geeky about tech. And so I think he just loves it. You just get that impression. So, you know, I don't remember, you remember all the meme wars about him, like all the crazy memes that people were making with AI and him, and he participated in it, like incredibly wittily, incidentally. So I think all this, the tech stuff, you know, you would think he's being ineffective because he should be worried about the tech right, right? And so you think, oh, okay, like even if he's not trying to push back or he's trying and he's failing. But I think probably what's more plausible is that he is a techno-optimist deep down. And so he actually likes the idea of not regulating AI. He's actually very personally sanguine about it. So maybe he's getting the exact policy he wants by not doing AI regulation. It's just really hard to say because this is what happens when you have a diversity of ideological influences and there's tension. You can sort of see it from one perspective, you can see it from the other perspective. So I think there's part of Vance is perfectly happy to hang out with techno venture capitalist types. It just comes naturally to him. It's his social group, you know. Catholicism comes later. Not to say he doesn't care about his Catholicism. I mean, he talks about it a lot more than any vice president would have to. So it's very hard to say. Like, if he's against the tech right, he's being ineffective. If he's for them, he's being effective. It's really hard to know. It depends on which of the strands of him that he's favoring. So I mean, it's a really good question. I think if he were a consistent, foundationally Catholic post-liberal person, he would be being very ineffective right now. Mm-hmm. If in fact that's the base, that's the strongest tendency in his own fault. She'll come back here. Yeah.
My question was just like, how will we like obtain the resources for rapid tech innovation without free trade, but also while staying isolationist and like out of wars for resources?
Yeah, those are two big issues. So the Trump administration, I think, has a kind of autocratic model where we should be manufacturing, like, let's just focus on AI policy. I mean, this is like I'm a very serious free trader, but on this, there's a difference, right? Because it's kind of like sharing nukes that way. I mean, again, we don't know exactly what these chips can do. I think ultimately they want the manufacturing of the chips to be done in the US. It's going to make it a lot more expensive though. One thing Musk has pointed out, and this is geopolitically very important, and it's difficult when antagonizing China, is that because Musk has a very interesting discussion on this. Whenever he talks about tech infrastructure, everyone on Earth should listen. But if you think about Doge or whatever, like if he's talking about moving tech infrastructure, manufacturing, he's a global expert. Okay. And he pointed out that there's a step in the fabrication of the chips that only one country in the world does, Taiwan. And so the more and more these chips become a commodity, the more and more incentive China has to try to take it. Now, the Taiwanese knew this. I've read that they booby trap them essentially. They'll destroy them if China tries to invade. So the whole world will be deprived of chips. And the cool thing about that is it discourages China taking Taiwan. I mean, I don't know if they could do it anyway, because it's, the more I read about it, it looks like just it would be a complete nightmare to actually try to do. But so there's a complicated set of, like, there's a geopolitical element and then there's the economic productivity element, and the fact that we have these global supply chains. And so I think ultimately they want to decouple them. I think part of what the trade war is doing is to kind of wean people off Chinese goods and then try to reshore as much as possible, so that as much as possible is being made domestically. Now, if you follow the nuclear analogy, it makes perfect sense, right? Like, you don't want parts of the, like, oh, I can't build a nuclear bomb unless, like, the bombs are made partly in Taiwan with respect to China, or heck, maybe Ukraine, right? What if Ukraine had one of the only places where you could refine nuclear material, right? So Russia's like, oh yeah, well, Russia's gonna take it, right? So the complication is, I think ultimately the goal is reshoring the complete military independence of the United States. And if that requires the fabrication of these graphical processing units, then, that's what has to be done. Now, that's going to make them more expensive, a lot more expensive. And that means accumulating them is going to be harder, slow us down. And it's also the case that China is in many ways better at moving infrastructure than we are, like a lot better. And they can probably do the national outlay for the manufacturing part better than we can. So I think unless you have free trade, they've got 1.5 billion people, right? We've got 300 billion or so. I actually do think you need a pretty big free trade network to most effectively make these chips. And so that's the importance of isolating China. So I actually agree with you, like, how are we going to get all the resources if we limit trade this much, right? It also makes us poorer in lots of ways. So yeah, I mean, it's a real tension. But I think they think if you do it domestically, that would be best. So that was your first question, was about trade. But then there was a second piece to it, I think I missed.
Yeah, so it was just like without free trade, but also without like entering wars for resources.
Yeah, so that's hard. A lot of it depends on what the EU wants to do. Because they passed this like heavy regulation of AI, and then China and the US just sped way far ahead of them, way in advance. And so it looks like they're about to do away with that big AI regulatory bill that they passed, so they can try to catch up. Pretty hard to catch up with the speed of this tech. So the interesting question is, what's the relationship between the US and the EU? Because a lot of our foreign intervention lately has been in protecting Europe, essentially, right? So the question is, to what extent can they defend themselves? To what extent can they choose, good policy? To what extent are we going to continue the post-World War II order of guaranteed protection of them? If we backed away from that, then the question is, well, what happens in Europe? My worry, again, not a foreign policy guy here, but I've read enough about it that I think a weak Russia, I think the reason, if you're being charitable to Trump, that you want a strong Russia is so it doesn't become a Chinese vassal state. The other reason I think that Trump's trying to get Greenland is because he knows the ice cap is melting, and it's going to be really important to be able to meet military ships and stuff up there. So you want as many bases and control of Greenland as possible. I just don't think a lot of this international stuff is totally crazy. This is why he's threatened Taiwan or Panama. And Trump was talking about annexing Panama because the Chinese have built up on the Panama Canal a huge amount of real estate. So a huge amount of what's going on, I think, is envisioning and continuing strengthening China, trying to figure out ways to stop that or slow it. And if you look at a lot of the Trump foreign policy as trying to position the US to resist China, a lot of it falls into place. Trade war, Panama, Greenland, Russia, all of it. So you back away from Europe, good terms with Putin. You want a strong Russia, because Russia as a Chinese vassal state, of course. I'm not saying that's what they're thinking, but I think that's the kind of rationale that like a very pro-Trump person would try to produce. That like, we're not being isolationist by not helping Ukraine. We are rejecting this kind of woke international order, but they're all over projecting that. But again, if I were a defender of the Trump administration, I would say, if you understand they're trying to limit China's power, they're doing a lot of stuff that at least sort of looks like it's helpful with that. So you could say it's isolationist in a sense, but there may be another way of looking at it, where they're just anticipating the unipolar order was not going to survive. And so if there's going to be a multipolar order, what multipolar order do we want it to be? Do we want it to be US, EU against Russia, China? Or do we want something else? Right? So yeah, again, I'm not a foreign policy guy. I do some reading in it, but so, I can't say for sure at all. But that's how I think they would answer you.
I'm kind of interested in the Christianity aspect.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe,
yeah.
like,
me too.
kind of two parts. So the first part would be, you talked a lot about like the Catholic side, but I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, obviously it's like very diverse. It's hard to say exactly, but on the Protestant side, like,
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, I've been looking at like Protestant thinkers or
Yeah.
any like what is kind of coming from that side.
Yeah,
And then the next part would be for kind of just like regular, like everyday, I mean, yeah, in the world, like specifically in America, like just regular Christians or like mega Christians. Cause like right now, it kind of seems to me like this sort of, they kind of like Elon and Trump and maybe kind of just ignore the whole, like, Elon has 8 kids that are from IVF and they're promoting like brain chips and
Yeah.
saying that like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is his Bible or something. I think.
yeah,
So
yeah.
how are they, like, right now they seem to have kind of, ignored that, but what, in the future, what are, regular mega Christians, what's, what might happen with them, I guess?
It almost broke apart over H-1B visas. So it's not completely stable alliance. Because MAGA is against H-1B and Musk and Vivek were like extreme meritocrats. And you started actually seeing a little bit of this in MAGA Twitter getting kind of racist against Indians. It was pretty gross, actually. Because I mean, India, I mean, Tyler Cowen's pointed this, kind of having a renaissance in terms of its cultural influence, the influence of major Indian leaders. I mean, not even former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, right? Almost president. I mean, because Kamala's half Indian. CEOs, tech CEOs, right? So there is this kind of American meritocratic, hire the best people. And Musk's whole thing is, produce the best product for humanity as a whole, right? Like he doesn't like mass immigration, but it's because he's worried that they're all going to become voters and then just destroy the culture and innovation of the United States. And also its like fundamental democratic and free structure. So his argument against immigration isn't anything nativist at all. It's a lot of it's just like very instrumental, I think. So there's already this instability, right? Where MAGA wants to prioritize Americans and the tech right wants to prioritize IQ, essentially. And those don't necessarily go together, right? I actually think, I'm with Musk and the others on the H-1B stuff although partly. I like to think if the smartest folks for China are working at US companies, that would have a salutary effect. Maybe not. Maybe that's naive. But in any case, so there's that one tension right there. Now with the Christianity part, this is pretty complicated because I see MAGA as a kind of post-Christian right. So if you look at the kind of people, the Christians that Trump is platforming, a lot of them are considered like heretics, like Paul White, for instance. And so he celebrated a lot of like prosperity gospel people, where I just see the prosperity gospel as like pretty much heresy. This idea that God actively wants us to be rich, but there's a lot more to it. That's not actually inherently absurd that God would like prosperity, but the way they pursue it, the way they say you can just sort of get it, right? Is a pretty big problem. So Trump is also, I think, so a lot of the folks that are the most MAGA, they're not very observant. It used to be the case out of the first Trump administration that the hardest core MAGA people were not religious, were not very religious. Now that's changed a bit as the coalition's problem. But there's not like, it's not like George W. Bush where you're like bringing the Bible into forming policy, right? There's no religious right really now. Right? Like it's not really separate from Trump. There's no distance. So like with the religious right, Trump could never have gotten the nomination if it had any power at all. Right? Just given his personal history. Right? I mean, George W. Bush had his own difficulties with his alcoholism background. So it's the weakening of the religious right that I think made MAGA even possible. Now, the way that doesn't answer your question is to say that MAGA Christianity isn't going to push very much back against Trump at all. And so what Trump's going to do is what they're going to do. Now he won't be around forever. So then the question is, well, what do they do? I don't know. It's hard to say. But yeah, I think right now, American Christianity is in a pretty fascinating place, because for a while we were just telling this declinist narrative about, people becoming non-religiously affiliated and so on. But COVID seems to have, or something like it seems to have slowed it down quite a bit. I don't know if you've seen some of this recent data on church attendance among Gen Z. It's quite striking, and it isn't just the US either. It's in the UK as well. I think for the first time since Henry VIII, you're going to have more observant Catholics in the UK than Anglicans. So, yeah. So, I think it's very hard to say in for MAGA Christians how much there's the Christian and how much there's the MAGA. I'm not saying that Christians can't be populists and nationalists, by the way. I think there's some tensions. I don't think they're outright contradictions. But as presently constituted, I just would stress MAGA is MAGA. There's just too much weird heretical stuff popping up among them all the time. It just does not have a Christian feel to it at all. It does not feel like the Mormon majority felt in the 80s. So I don't know how much MAGA Christianity is even a thing. I think Protestant political thought is in kind of this interesting period, because as the nuns have arisen, you go from, oh, we don't have to exactly argue for our views because we're the majority, right? But now you see a lot of Reformed folks going in for Christian nationalism or something like it, trying to argue for it. I think Joe and I probably disagree though, but I actually think it's pretty hard to have a consistent anti-liberal Protestantism. I think it's pretty tough, particularly with the stress on freedom of conscience and private interpretation of scripture. So seeing Protestants go full on anti-liberal, I think there's some tension. I think it's kind of hard. It's much easier with Catholicism. There's massive historical precedent for it, and the theology allows for it without a huge amount of tension. That gets me in trouble with many non or liberal Catholics. Okay. So it's kind of weird where Protestant Christian intellectuals are. They kind of don't know where they are. There's a cacophony of different voices. Liberal Protestants aren't producing many people by way of political thinkers. Even the mainline center right isn't doing very much by way of producing political thinkers among Protestants. It's really the new right that are producing people. But and there are problems with the quality of argument. So American Protestants is very hard to say. It's kind of all over the place. I mean, it's truly a cacophony. There's no one like Reinhold Niebuhr in the 50s, major, or even Billy Graham for that matter. Not he's a political thinker, but a Christian that almost all Christians think is good and should be influential. I think the very last cross-Christian celebrated person that has wide cultural influence is Dolly Parton. She's incredibly popular everywhere. And she was basically, an evangelical, pretty serious evangelical Christian. So there's very few people in the culture that can be cultural leaders of Christianity in the country among Protestants. So yeah, I just don't know. I mean, there's too many countervailing, contradictory tendencies that it's very, very hard to say what's to be made of this. Because when you look at I've said enough about that, but so the long and short of it is there's too many contradictory dynamics and currents for me to say anything consistent. And
I feel like you counter-signaled at some point the narrative that, look, we tried to liberalize with China and but they didn't liberalize. Do you think that they would liberalize if we maintained, active trade and just were more patient, or no?
I don't know. And because the problem is China's a pretty distinctive civilization and it's very hard to understand. And I was studying Confucian political thought for a while when I was writing All the Kingdoms of the World and writing on it in the back half of the book. And so that was really my first introduction to anything in terms of Chinese history. And even though, it's a very ancient culture and country, but there's a lot of diversity within it, there's also been a really fascinating continuity of elite ethos. So there are some who argue that the Chinese had the very first nation state, and that they've had a nation state more or less continuously for 1,000 years longer than Europe. after the fall of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. You have all these dynasties, but the dynasties, they not just dynasties, they have a bureaucracy. And even since the time of Confucius, who himself is trying to preserve certain classical teachings, that for Chinese bureaucrats for thousands of years, basically they have an SAT test, and it's knowing the Confucian classics. So you've essentially got a meritocratic bureaucracy, and a religion for the bureaucrats is essentially a code, right, of ethics, right? There's ritual and so on. There's no necessary like deity or God. There's Tian or heaven, but whether it's an agent or not it's kind of disputed. And so they have this ethos of like meritocratic bureaucracy that's not a communist thing. Like that's like an ancient thing. And so I think their commitment, they're also their internal commitment to order. People look at them too imperialistically. I mean, they're obsessed with trying to maintain their internal stability and the claims over what they have, because there's a couple of different elements there. Like with national humiliation, they talk about one of the reasons they're so hostile to Western liberalism, as they felt like, you know, they were badly mistreated. And they also see it as imperialistic. They see liberalism as imperialist, which has not always been false, by the way. So I just don't feel like I can say very much about it, except that there's a couple of clear, beyond massive human rights violations. They've got a couple of problems. The biggest problem is demographic collapse, which most of the Confucian democracies are facing too, right? South Korea's probably, it's just a free fall. But China, I think 2050, they go down to 1 billion people, and 2100, 800 billion or so. So, and that's going to really change things. When does India become more populous than China, than people think? It's not there yet, but it's there. Oh, it crossed already. Okay. Because India's actually got a fairly high fertility rate. I don't know how that matters. You know, I don't understand almost anything about Chinese-India relations. It seems like it's fantastically complicated. I don't know anything about it. So but presumably what matters is going on, you know, with the countries on their border, but also our attempt to basically guarantee the security of every Confucian democracy, right? Like we're committed to defending Japan. We're committed to defending Taiwan, maybe. We're, I think, committed to defending South Korea. Actually done that. So I don't know. I mean, China has to handle a lot of internal challenges, but the population bomb is a big deal. They've also got another problem, and since it's Dan's show, I could talk a little bit more about this, which is that they've aborted so many women that you've got a lot of men and there are no women for them to marry. And that's really, really bad. Like, I think like men who cannot find like stable relationships with women, I think it's just like, and you have a lot of them, like, it's just not a good thing. I think anyone in a spare moment, an honest moment, knows that that's true. You don't want a very large incel population. Okay? I'm not saying anything about what to do about that, but like in terms of like your stuff about thinking about family relations, broader political implications, it's really important. So they've got that problem to deal with too. They've also got just the fact that there's a tremendous amount of local corruption. It's just massive. She has tried to put a stop to it in lots of different ways. It's really tough work. So, you know, then they also fall into total catastrophes periodically, just massive ones. Mass famine under Mao, the Taiping Rebellion, tens of millions of people will die every, you know, few 80 years or so. Not every 80 years, but so there's a lot of difficulties that they face. But again, I learned enough about Chinese history to know how to blame it. But that their internal concerns are very different. And when I try to take their perspective as someone who sort of grew up within Chinese culture, I would be gung-ho about getting AI for my country. Because from their perspective, they're not being imperialist, right? Taiwan is a rogue province. Tibet's a somewhat rogue province. It's just part, and they have a territorial integrity, right? It's the US, it's everywhere. And China just has to defend itself, right? They say, look, we have the snowball culture, we have this ancient civilization, we were the richest country in the world for a long time, where almost everything interesting was going on in terms of scientific advancement. Mao and some others, many of them, I think, can admit, at the very least, slowed them down a bit. And maybe all the best decisions weren't made. But I think they're completely committed to making.
Mistakes were made.
Yes, I know. Well, you got a lot of Chinese folks with Mao pictures in their houses, so, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, if I'm them, I'm wanting to get AI as quickly as possible. I mean, what they're doing right now is pretty brilliant. I mean, it's kind of what they've done for a while, but if you look into the background of what happened with AI, like with DeepSeek, essentially they developed this AI, they lie about how much it cost because they didn't talk about how much infrastructure they had to buy. The training of the AI was very cheap, but essentially what they're doing is they're trying to destroy the profit margins of American AI companies by producing extremely good but extremely cheap knockoffs. Very good at cheap knockoffs, right? Like they're really, really good at cheap knockoffs, right? And there's some evidence now that there may have even been some espionage in OpenAI, and the DeepSeek is maybe partly what they call distilled from ChatGPT. So if the Chinese can keep coming out with cheap AI that's 1/100th of the cost, then people will look at OpenAI and say, well, why? That's why NVIDIA lost like 17% of its stock value when DeepSeek came out. It's because people were like, well, I mean, if you could be done for 100th of the cost, like why would I invest in these AI companies? Like, I don't need to do it. People just figure out cheap ways to make technology. So the real test for China is in here about 2 weeks when they come up with DeepSeek R2. And R2 is supposed to, it's supposed to be the next level up. So it better be really, really, really good. But I think they're just intensely nationally invested. I mean, I look at their AI policy a lot like I look at the way they prepare for the Olympics, which is, disturbingly intense, right? Yeah, but I think, they're gonna pour every bit of effort into it. And if I were them, I would. But again, I'm much more comfortable with, say, European history. I still don't know very much, but just even spending about 6 months with Confucian stuff, it's just, I'm just not confident in anything I have to say about China. Except I really don't want them to have better AI than we do. That I'm confident.
So, this is a general question.
Yeah.
You at one point said, and in the Q&A, any ideology has internal tension. So
Yes.
kind of to maybe wrap things up, how devastating or deep do you think the tensions that you sketched in J.D. Vance's thought are? And here's just a quick argument. Maybe they're not very devastating, not very deep. In terms of the economic tension, policy trade-offs, or that's just part of life, or pretty much any ideology. And in terms of the anthropological tension, I imagine that J.D. Vance's considered view could be or might be, there should be certain guardrails in place with tech policy. There are certain things that are, very clearly immoral in the light of, the Catholic teaching. But we don't have to be Luddites. We don't have to be Amish. Like in general, technological progress can be a good thing, and it can contribute even to distinctively post-liberal goods, perhaps. Or but yeah, how deep do you think?
So the way you can try to navigate potential tensions in your thought between principles is a certain belief about empirical reality where they don't actually conflict with each other. And that's oftentimes the way that people try to make the ideological tensions work, is they just postulate empirical conditions where there aren't conflicts. If you want to do that, you can, and no one can stop them, right? You could always postulate with liberalism, right? It's like, okay, we want free trade and we want democracy. And so, it's a little, I had the false belief, right? I had a false empirical belief that if we had free trade with China, that would make it liberal and democratic eventually. Right. So that empirical belief allowed me to avoid facing the tension between the liberal part, right, of me that's for free trade, and then the democratic part of me that wants universal democracy. I mean, not universal exactly, but something like it. So I think a lot of times people will postulate unsupported or poorly supported empirical beliefs to make sure their principles don't conflict. But if I were Vance, here's what I would say. just trying to resolve it. So number one, these are preliminary policy suggestions for how to deal with AI. We've got to stay on top of it, actually create the right incentives, and then just dynamically adjust. We need to make regulation more efficient so that we can do what we need to do when we need it. Okay, that's what I would say there. It's like we have to do something, have to protect American workers. Then I think what he would really stress is what you suggested, which is to stress the geopolitical. It's just to say, look, we have to, like, we're post-liberals, but we're Catholic post-liberals, we're not Chinese post-liberals, and so, that has to be resisted. Now, one of the saddest things about the post-liberals is actually how much they are like China and are friendly with it. They've had to kind of mute. So for Neil, has been fascinated by Chinese culture since undergraduate. His wife's Chinese. And he just loves Chinese civilization. I've even said Biden criticized Xi, and he said things like, "Oh, it's so rude" or whatever. He reteach Chinese state media. So I think he thinks there's a lot to learn from China. That they're focused on the common good, even though they have the wrong notion of it. And then Deneen in an editorial, I think he wrote with is it Papin and Amari, where they call China a civilizational equal. And I think they like it because it's a society that is perfectly willing to promote the common good as it sees it, right? It sees no restraint, say, in banning all kids from having too many video games, right? So I think that's one thing they don't mind about it, is that they're willing to wield executive power boldly and fully in the name of the good. They happen to be wrong about the good, but at least they're willing to do it. They're going to have to. They've already muted all of that stuff. And they have to now, because now their friend is involved in a trade war, right? So they have to mute all of that. So if I were Vance, at least, I would just stress the geopolitical necessity of it. And then I think what he wants to say is about the tech right. He said, look, I know these guys, they mean well, their worldview is horribly mistaken, but politics makes for strange bedfellows, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Right? And the big danger to the world right now, I think in Vance's mind, are ultimately, I think deep down, it's ultimately the threats to the church. And the threats to the church are first and foremost the sort of woke global left, which he sees as a deeply, deeply anti-Christian force. And in some ways, it is an anti-Christian force. That has wielded power in various perverse ways that corrupt people all over the world, right? And then also the Chinese as well, because it's also a deeply anti-Christian. The CCP is a deeply anti-Christian organization, right? In terms of the suppression of Christianity, shutting down churches, forcing Christians to replace posters of Jesus with Xi, So I think it's kind of a balance. But I would like to say, like, drill down to the deep commitment. I think he's deep. I think the post-liberalism is really deep. I think the Catholicism and the I even think he'll never admit this now. He's a national politician, but I bet he would say the ideal world is an integral. Like I'm pretty confident of that from what I know of him and the people he's talked to. So the ultimate commitment is like you have to protect the church and its flourishing. And that's just driving a huge amount. I think he's very loyal to his country and his state, and his town, his people, family. But that's, if I were him, my goal is just protect the church, right? Just protect the church. Then I make a alliance of convenience with the techno-optimists, hope they're right, emphasize geopolitical necessity, do the very best you can with the policy to make sure it works for people, and then you just pray. Right. So if I'm trying to be the most possible consistent Vance, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm thinking. So that's what I call these tensions and not contradictions. Right. They're not contradictions. There's not X and not X. Right. But the way that he's tried to work them out or not work them out are significant enough to examine. I think we can see, like, trying to sort of see the differences and the tensions that work through them is actually very fruitful. I feel like I've learned a lot just in speaking on this for the first time. Not strict contradictions, but if I'm Vance, I'm stressing geopolitics, alliances of convenience, and sort of careful policy formation. Now, whether any of that's possible, in the Trump administration. I don't know. But yeah, so if I maximally cheered over Vance, that's what I want to say.